Today, I have a really special guest, Amy Sutherland, who wrote the book, What Shamu Taught Me About Life, Love, and Marriage. And we're going to get to her intro in just a minute. Before we get to that, I just wanted to give a shout out to a reader of Turn Autism Around, an action guide for parents of young children with early signs of autism. It just came out this past spring, and an Amazon review, 5-star review by Tweaker Beaker, said, "This is a perfect book for those who are not fortunate enough to have ABA therapy available for whatever reason, or for those who want to get started while on the long wait list." We then went on to couple it with her online course, referring back to the book as needed. We have seen such great changes in a short time. I love to read these Amazon reviews, podcast reviews. And if you want to just read the first chapter of this book, listen to the second chapter, and get all the free assessment forms, planning forms that are in the book, just go to turnautismaround.com. Okay, let's get to this intro of Amy Sutherland, who wrote this really great 2008 book called What Shamu Taught Me About Life, Love, and Marriage. I read it back then. I reread it recently in preparation for this interview. Amy and I talk all about positive reinforcement for animals, for humans, how to shape behavior, what she learned by being a journalist in the animal training field. It's a really fascinating interview. It's a great book. And we tie it all into how to better work with children with autism, but also how to improve our relationships and be happier as human beings as well. So Amy is, like I said, a journalist. She's a regular contributor to the Boston Globe. She wrote 4 books, including this What Shamu Taught Me book. She lives in Charleston with her husband, and she is just a really fascinating guest. So let's get to this really amazing interview with Amy Sutherland. Okay, thanks so much for joining me, Amy. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Mary. I really appreciate being on.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of your work for over a decade now. So why don't you tell our listeners, I know you're not in the autism world, but tell us how you got involved with animal human behavior and also the field of ABA.
Well, I'm a journalist, and I'll give you the quick version. Is I always was an animal lover, grew up with them, with lots of pets. And then I got an Australian Shepherd. And, you know, they always tell you when you get an Australian Shepherd, if you don't give them a job, they're going to come up with their own job. So I started going to a trainer then who was doing clicker training, which at that point was still, it was known, but not widely known. And I just sort of stumbled upon her. And I found that so intellectually engaging that I just kept going to class after class. And then I had an assignment where I went on to the set of 101 Dalmatians. It was the second one, whatever that one was. Anyhow, if anybody remembers that movie, but it had Glenn Close in it again. And there were a ton of trainers on the set, obviously. What people don't know in a movie is every animal has one trainer. So if you see people. Yeah, so if you see 6 dogs in a scene, there's 6 trainers usually hiding all over the set, giving those dogs cues. And if you look carefully, you can see because where the dogs are looking. But anyhow, so all these trainers had gone to this school I had never heard of called the Exotic Animal Training Management Program at Moore Park Community College, which goes by the awful kind of acronym of EATM. And that's their Harvard, and everybody in the training world knows about it. And it just seemed like an impossible thing. And so when I was looking for a book idea, given my love of animals and training, and also just humans too, because I knew there would be plenty of drama, I spent a year and a half following the students going through that program, which was like going into a magical kingdom where they learned to work with cougars and macaws, and we even had a hyena and baboons and, you know, big snakes. I mean, it really was nuts, and it was magical, but I also sort of learned a whole new way of thinking by spending so much time with them, which was, I knew it'd be interesting, but I didn't expect that to happen to me.
Wow. So this is the book that came out of that experience, right?
Well, there was a book before that, which is a direct journalistic book called Kicked, Bitten, and Scratched. And
Okay.
that's the book of the time I spent at the school. And then I wrote, as a way to help promote that book, I pitched a modern love column on how I had started using basically exotic animal training thinking in my own marriage to improve it. So I wrote this column, a modern love column for the New York Times, that became insanely popular, which is still kind of blows me away. But and that then led to that book. So that book is a much more in-depth description of how I changed and, you know, how I applied what I learned at the feet of exotic animal trainers, watching them work with every species under the sun, into using that thinking with humans.
Wow. So the book is called What Shamu Taught Me About Life, Love, and Marriage. And I read it more than a decade ago. It came out in 2008. And I read it a decade ago. I just reread a lot of the book after Amy agreed to be on the show. So I love the book. I love the story. I love kind of how you fell into the whole world of animal training, and then wrote such accessible literature, book, articles on how we can use, and we do use, whether we
Right.
know it or not, or like it,
Yeah.
we use the animal procedures of shaping, chaining, positive reinforcement,
Right.
extension, all of the techniques that I talk about in my courses for children with autism are used across animal species.
Yeah,
So why do you
absolutely.
think some people have a real problem with that? That some people are like, she's trying to treat us like dogs, and this is like dog training,
I
and
know. I
that to
know.
my
I
child
mean,
with autism.
part of it, there's multiple reasons. One is this overarching idea, which is, actually incorrect, that we are not part of the animal kingdom. Like it or not, you are. We're Homo sapiens, right? And a lot of Western tradition has taught us that we're not, and that we're the boss of everything. So to be compared to an animal is always denigrating. A lot of it too is ideas of old school training, which weren't so nice. And nobody would want to be treated the way some early animals were trained in, like, say, circuses and early zoos. And then the other thing is just sort of a lack of some, general knowledge, which is, I'm not surprised people don't know this, but the 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 way progressive animal training came about is it took the ideas of human psychology from B.F. Skinner and borrowed them into their work. And it was the marine mammal trainers who, for the first time working with animals, were confronted with animals they couldn't physically get their hands on, right? So they can't push them or make them sit if they don't want to, you know what I mean? So they had to come up with plan B. And plan B was supplied by B.F. Skinner in his research in how animals best learn through reinforcement.
And I talk about B.F. Skinner's 1957 work called Verbal Behavior, because my first book is called The Verbal Behavior Approach, but he has several other books and a lot of writings done
Right.
in the early to mid 1950s, 30s, like in that range. He wrote a lot about how any behavior can be changed.
Right.
And strengthened and weakened, and so you're saying that then at that point the animal world was like, wow, he's onto something, because with a whale or a cougar, how else are you going to train them or get them to just not attack people or get them well when they're
Right.
sick and
Yeah.
all that stuff. So the animal world really embraced B.F. Skinner
Right.
years before the psychology human world.
I think so. I mean, because
It makes
the
sense.
marine mammal trainers proved essentially that it worked, and then they also proved not only that they could train and teach and work with dolphins and other marine mammals using well-timed reinforcement with markers and all that, but they showed the range of things they could teach. The range of behaviors was dramatically bigger than anybody who was using negative old school training could get. And that opened the eyes of a lot of people, especially like in zoos. Zoos didn't want to use punishment. So when they saw that they could get behaviors using positive training, also started to realize they could gain things that they hadn't thought of before, like animal hold still for a blood draw, or how to have, but they had trained their dart frogs to jump onto scale to get weight frogs. So the impossible things just didn't seem possible.
Yeah. So how did you, and I do want to mention too, you said about clicker training, which was Karen Pryor developed that, and that is
Right.
a click, a marker to mark a good behavior, which signals that reinforcement is available. So for a dolphin who's gonna jump up and touch a mark, he touches the mark. Well, you can't feed him a fish right when his nose is on the mark.
Right.
So you click, and as soon as his nose matches, touches, and then that signals to him, or in the dolphin's case, you whistle so that the dolphin can hear it. And then he knows that the next time he comes around, he gets a fish because he did the behavior right. So in
Yeah.
the 1990s, 2000s, Karen Pryor and some other people, including Teresa McKeon, who I had on my podcast. We can put that podcast in the show notes on Tag Teach, which is teaching with acoustical guidance, and basically took Karen Pryor's clicker training with animals and moved it to clicker training with humans. And I became certified in Tag Teach and did a presentation and all that stuff. So I just want to explain to everyone that this clicker training, and if you are training a dog, getting training obedience school or whatever, you want to look for these positive methods, the clicker training and positive methods, not we'll shock the dog, or we'll put a collar on and we'll pull it back and choke the dog. We want to look for very positive animal training techniques.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, just as a side note, after I wrote these books, I went and I volunteered with shelter dogs for 10 plus years, and I worked with the most difficult dogs. And the only reason we could really do anything with them, work with them, is because we used positive training methods. And that has also revolutionized the shelter dog world because of using positive training. So just to show you how important and good it is.
Right. And to treat each animal, whether that's a little child with or without autism, or a dog, treat them more like a whale, where you can't physically touch
Right,
them,
exactly.
because you want behavior to be elicited by the animal.
Right.
And not prompted, and not, definitely not in any way forcefully prompted, because then
Yeah.
you're getting into punishment techniques. Okay,
Right.
why don't you tell our listeners some of the things you did differently with your husband then, after you learned all these animal techniques?
I think the fundamental thing I changed in my life with my husband and with people in general, I will say other people in my life, is sort of using the sort of basic rule that you get what you reinforce, right? So I started to consider my own behavior and how I might have been inadvertently reinforcing stuff I did not want from my husband and other people, or how I was inadvertently reinforcing, missing reinforcing what I did want. That's the part a lot of people miss, especially married people. They pay a lot of attention to what they don't want, and then when something good happens, whoosh, it just kind of goes
Right,
right past them, right?
right.
So anyhow, just that simple rule to understand that you get what you reinforce. It's so simple. But it takes a lot of thought and self-control. I like that kind of tension, like something simple, but that's hard to do. So,
So what did you do about nagging? Were you having a problem with nagging and then you,
well, yeah, I'm married. Of course, I nag. uh, that'd be part of your vows, like I vow to nag for the next 50 years. But the problem with nagging is it's attention to what you don't want, right? It's negative, a negative reinforcer. But it's just not, it's not. And also the other thing is, one of the things I loved about animal trainers is that if something didn't work, they always tried something else. And that is a fundamental problem with nagging, thus the word, is that you're repeating yourself. So if you have to keep saying the same thing, it's not working. And that alone, forget whether it's reinforcing or not, that alone should tell you to stop. So I pretty much stopped.
Mhm.
I mean,
And
it's impossible to stop 100%, but
right. And I think in the book that I just reread, you talked about an example is your husband was looking for his keys. And
mhm.
normally you would have, before you learned about it,
Oh God, yeah.
you would like drop everything, help him look for his keys. Um,
Yeah, and I learned that attention is almost always reinforcing, even negative attention, which is hard for us to understand, but it's true. Even though we get scads of examples of it in our life, right? Uh, but yeah, I learned that I was not only reinforcing it, I was sort of like pressurizing it by getting involved, right? Now something that was a simple, oversight was becoming this huge drama between me and him. And so it clearly, the bottom line was I wasn't helping. I wasn't getting what I wanted. I wasn't helping. So I just learned to not say anything. And if I can do it, any woman can.
okay, so ignore the stuff you don't want,
Right.
and 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 give positive attention when your husband or your friend or your mother or your sister is doing something that you want to see more of. And that's
Yeah.
an example I give a lot is, if a child, whether they have autism or not, if they're playing quietly, you're more likely to just leave
Right.
them alone. And then once they start crying or hitting their sibling, that's when you intervene, where it should be the opposite. They're being
Right.
good, they're being quiet, they're playing nicely. You should be interjecting. And it does take some work. And it does take
Yeah.
some habit training to your brain to be like, hey, every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, I need to go in and give attention and give praise for things going well,
Right.
instead of reacting to squeaky wheel. Okay, so I think there's a lot. In fact, when you were mentioning about the school that you went to, I happened to be on a plane with somebody sitting right next to her, and she turns out I was studying something about B.F. Skinner, and we got to talking, and she was an animal trainer, and she had studied at that school, and she was either on her way home from transporting a walrus or a seal, and she and I hit it off, and actually she
Yeah.
gave me
Right.
her number, and she worked at a zoo, and I tried to contact her years later, and she was like off that day, but like it was a really great exchange. But one of the things she told me is like all of the medical procedures that
Yeah,
they
it's
basically
amazing.
train, and I'm thinking if you can train a cougar or a walrus to extend their arm or their flipper or whatever it is,
Mm,
or a blood draw, then you should be able to, a lot of my work is on desensitization. I have a chapter
right.
in the book on desensitization to aversive events like going to the doctor, dentist, haircuts. Um, and there's such an overlap. But did you see a lot of medical procedures done when you were at the school?
Yeah, the students had to train a behavior for a final grade, and a lot of them worked on injections. They weren't actually injecting anything, but they were desensitizing the animal to get injections. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that it was different for every species how they had to do that. And not even in some practical ways too. Like, could they go into the enclosure with the animal? Then that's a different setup, right? Sometimes if, like, I remember there was a goat, Wendell, this kind of African goat, and the whole thing was to get him to hold still because goats are kind of like busy, active animals. And then you have animals like the baboons learning, so they could go in with them, but I don't think they were doing it for this. But the animals you can't go in with, they train them to stay up against the enclosure and hold still while they do these things to them, which is pretty miraculous. So, and the way they desensitize them was not only different species to species, but one of the things that I found really interesting about the way animal trainers think is that they thought of each animal as an individual. So there was not a set, like there was a protocol, but how fast it went depended on that animal. And it wasn't set in stone, right? So if they were having trouble desensitizing, it might be because they were going too fast. It
Mm-hmm.
might be because there weren't enough steps. It might be because the animal was more comfortable with one trainer than the other. It just went on and on and on. That's the thing, is that everybody wants a recipe for these kinds of things. And when I saw people work with these animals, what they constantly were doing were responding to the individual animal and always rethinking what they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
That's always staying flexible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and individualizing it. And pretty much
Right.
my idea is if you see problem behavior, the demands are too high and or reinforcements too low. So in
Right.
many cases, you're rushing the steps. In my book, for example, on the desensitization chapter, there was a mom who all of a sudden her child didn't want to get into the bathtub. And freaked out. And I was just like, oh, that's weird. Maybe she was held down for something. Yeah, she was held down last week for an MRI. Okay, it spilled over.
Oh,
Now she was aversive to getting in the bathtub. Okay, so now we have to go backwards and we have to maybe have her play outside the bathtub, reaching over, maybe get new tub toys. So she's fully clothed playing in the water. Now she's like maybe in her bathing suit. Maybe,
right.
like, I don't know what's going to work, but here's some ideas to try. And then a week later, she was asking for more bath time. And so I got the
See,
mom to go like, okay, what are the steps that you used? What worked for her? And they are actually in chapter 13 of my book, the actual steps that work for
yeah,
that one child. So whether you're talking about a child or a goat or a walrus,
right. Yeah,
species, but it's also the individual, and maybe the demands are too high,
right.
maybe the reinforcements too low. But in a lot of cases, I agree. I think people are pushing too fast.
Yeah. Yeah, the best trainer in the country, perhaps in the world, is this man named Ken Ramirez, who used to be head of behavior at the Shed Aquarium and then has gone on to do all this incredible stuff, including training butterflies to fly over the London Philharmonic Orchestra in a
Yeah.
huge stadium on cue.
Wow.
So this guy can do anything, but he says whenever something isn't working, it's almost always because the reinforcement is too low or not often enough. It's not good enough, not often enough. So that's always the first thing he says he thinks about.
Yeah. Well, I agree with him. And I actually have read some of his work, and he is an amazing human as well. So, okay. So you talk about a couple things in your book that I thought would be good for our listeners. On page 106 of the paperback, What Shamu Taught Me, are 5 tips. We're just going to go over 3 tips. So what do you mean by when you say go back to kindergarten?
Go back to kindergarten means essentially that either for some reason you haven't done a behavior for a long time, or you're having trouble with the behavior, or the context has changed or whatever, and it just means you got to step back. Like, humans don't like that, but sometimes that's the way it goes, right? And you just have to, it's just like, think to yourself, like, you used to speak French. I used to speak French. I'll use my example. But I can't, it's been 10 years since I've been there. I can't assume that I'm going to get off the plane and speak French again like I did, right? So I go back to kindergarten and I start playing tapes, and so that it's not, people gain behaviors and they lose behaviors. And when they lose them for some reason, don't think about it so much. You just go back and start up again.
Yeah. Yeah. I see this. I mean, many parents, including myself, have experienced regression in their child, developmental regressions. And then there's also, where a child is almost potty trained. Now all of a sudden he's having accidents, or this little girl who all of a sudden was fearful of the bathtub, or all of a sudden, gets sick and starts sleeping with their parents, now doesn't want to sleep in their own bed. And it's like, well, I don't want to go back to a year ago when I started potty training, or he was, it's like, maybe you don't have to go back a year, but you can't just go like, what happened last week, I want back like that.
Yeah, right. The other thing is, usually when you go back to kindergarten, it typically moves at a much faster pace.
Yeah.
Than when you had to go through it the first time.
Yeah.
So.
And I think another good point that you make is about like speaking French, and you don't do it for a while. I think us as autism parents, we get paranoid, like, oh my God, it's another regression. It's like, it may be natural to lose skills, especially if they weren't practiced and they weren't fluent.
Yeah. Well, I think it maybe would help those parents too, to like, I mean, it's just behavior, and too often when we're thinking about behavior, we're talking about it because it's a problem behavior, but behavior runs through our lives constantly, and there's all kinds of behaviors that we might do this stuff with, but because we don't think of it as problem, it just goes like right past our head. Like every time I go downhill skiing, I got to start on the bunny hill again, right? And right, so it's the same idea.
Right. I like that. Okay, so go back to kindergarten. I think that was a good explanation. Okay, you have another new thing that I saw when I was rereading it, the new tank syndrome.
The new tank syndrome speaks to when you have something dialed in. I can't remember the example I used in the book, but let's say, you've trained an animal a certain behavior, and then, well, here, I'll use this from the dog world. I know talking about dogs can make people uncomfortable, but whatever. Is that people will train dogs for competition, right? And then when they train them in their homes, or they train them in outside, then they take them into the competition area, the building, with spectators. Okay, you've changed everything about that. Your cues, now you're asking your animal to do something in an absolutely brand new setting, which is totally distracting. They've never heard the sound, so you can't expect that you can take behaviors and just transfer them here and there to multiple contexts without some deterioration.
Yeah. So is there a way, I know with kids with autism, new school classrooms, new teachers,
Right.
from year to year, new building from, and so like as a behavior analyst in the human world, I would be like, okay, take pictures of the new environment, go visit the new environment, get a picture of the teacher, meet the teacher ahead of time. Like these are some strategies that I would use. So is there similar strategies that you would use to kind of prevent some of the new tank syndrome, or you just have to be aware?
I think I think it's great to try things like that to prevent it. I think it helps you to just, for one, to know that it's going to that it can happen, and just accept it.
Right.
That it might be a problem the first time, and that you then work through that. I mean, because you can show pictures, and you can do, I mean, a lot of trainers will take animals and train them in the different situations as a way to avoid that happening. But usually there's still something, that's still fundamentally different, especially like if it's an animal that's going to have to do cues in front of an audience. I mean, you're going to hire a whole school group to come in to help you desensitize. So I think, I think some of these things help you if you just understand that they can happen and why they can happen.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I like that. And how about the principle of try something different?
Oh, why do humans have so much trouble with this? I swear to God. That was a real, the thing is about humans is that if we try something and it doesn't work, our first reaction is to do it harder, louder, longer. I mean, we just cling to these things we're trying to do. And in the animal training world, they fight that, they help new trainers learn to fight that urge by saying, when plan A doesn't work, use plan B. Plan B doesn't work, use plan C. If you have to keep trying it, it's not working. And you got to come up with the next plan.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember way back in like 1999 when we started ABA programming for Lucas, the behavior specialist, there wasn't a behavior analyst back then, but she would say, when we start a program, if we start color identification or we start imitation or whatever, we want to get in the program, have him master it, and get out. And it kind of stuck with me because as a behavior analyst now, I see, or I have seen in the past where, people have been working on same different or colors or color green versus red for months. It's like, obviously, whatever
Yeah.
you're doing, he either doesn't have the prerequisite skills, there's not enough reinforcement, you don't have the right procedures, and you have to do something different. If the animals, whether it's a human animal or another type of animal, they're not making progress. How frustrating it would be for a cougar to extend its paw to do a blood draw, and what you're working on is not producing anything.
Right. Yeah.
It's
And
a waste
then,
of time for everybody, and it can be
oh,
frustrating for the animal.
well, I was going to say, and it can be frustrating for the quote trainer. And, that's how you can really end up with this, right? Because everybody's frustrated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So kind of always have a plan B and try to make progress. If it's not every day, certainly, you can't be going a week or two without any progress towards the next step, because then obviously something isn't right.
Right. Yeah. And, as I mentioned that, like in human interactions too, just sort of generally speaking, what I mentioned, that's why nagging doesn't, if nagging doesn't actually work. So I needed a plan B, but first I had to realize plan A wasn't working. But you just see a lot of the way people, couples and parents and family members interact in this repetitive way to try to get each other to do what they want. And then it's, If you're caught in that cycle and you've been doing the same thing forever, you need a plan B.
Love it. So how can people follow your work? This is one of 4 or 5 books that you wrote, but you haven't really written a book for a long time. And so what are you doing now, and how can people follow you?
Well, I've sort of changed hats again. I've kind of done that multiple times in my career. I still love animals, and but I am currently writing a standing piece for the Boston Globe book section, which is a Q&A with prominent authors about their own reading. So that's the behavior I'm writing about now, and that is the species writers that I'm talking with. I have to admit, though, that I have snuck in as many animal leaders and behaviorists in the country as possible to my work at the Globe. And like, for the example, do you know Franz de Waal? He's
No.
he writes great books about animals if you're an animal lover, and he is I think an evolutionary biologist in Atlanta. But anyhow, yeah, so that's I just do animals in my personal life.
And I don't own any pets. So I am actually, I really love learning about Tag Teach and your work, because it all makes sense. And I feel like the better I would get at training an animal, the better I could help kids with autism, especially kids without a lot of language, without language
Yeah, right.
comprehension,
Yeah,
because you can't explain something to a young child, without a lot of language comprehension. And,
right.
there's just, this is just a positive, child-friendly way to incorporate all of the steps for all the skills that you would ever need. So I would highly recommend people pick up the book, What Shamu Taught Me About Life, Love, and Marriage. It is an
Thank
old
you.
book, but it is a goodie, and I know I loved it. So, and we can follow Amy's work at the Boston Globe as well. So part of my podcast goals are for parents and professionals to be less stressed and lead happier lives. So do you have any self-care tips or stress management techniques that you use in your daily life that might help others listening?
Well, one of the things I learned with exotic animal trainers, it's actually something they talked about for the animals, but that then I apply to myself, and you'll see why, is that they would talk about, like, if the animal was overall happy. It wasn't just about the training, they wanted the animal to be in a good state to sort of be open to learning, right? So, like, did it have enough activity? Did it, what were the things that made that individual happy, and did it have enough? So I apply that to myself. I think, what makes this animal, Amy Sutherland, happy? And I especially think about it when I'm, sort of somewhat under stress. And I'm talking about simple stuff like walking enough, sleeping enough. I listen to a lot of music. Did I get enough music? Just think, like, what does your personal species need?
Love it. Love it. Well, thank you so much. It's been a true pleasure to get to
Oh,
talk to you
great.
today. I think my listeners will really love this interview, and I hope to keep in touch with you in the future. So thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, Mary. This was fabulous.